I'm going to preface my lecture with I'm not an expert on this topic. However, this is just a topic that I've been diving down into recently because just currently where we are with our company in Citylens, I think this applies currently. So I wanted to structure my presentation based off of what you guys have already done, right? So this probably looks familiar. You have your groups that you broke up into sub aspects, that you've broken up into KPIs. You've given them a method and benchmarks for your KPIs. So then my next section I'm going to be talking about is how do you consult the public? And then how do you prioritize your benchmarks and KPIs? But because this is all rooted in KPIs, you guys know this already, but I just need to iterate it again. KPIs are super good for benchmarking to track performance so citizens can see the data and see growth so that cities themselves know how their city is performing. KPIs are extremely good for accountability and transparency. It's also good for us to find the strengths and weaknesses of our city. So what can we focus on? How do we prioritize our efforts? Where do we spend our money, basically? And then for strategic planning, for not just planning off of decisions, but actually have data-driven decisions to make our plans for us and to track long-term impact and growth. But the problem with KPIs sometimes is we forget who we are designing for. So I want to bring us back to just really thinking, what are these benchmarks? For example, the 15-minute city. It sounds grand, it sounds great, and it is a great goal. But what does a 15-minute city mean for different people? And when they say, maybe in your KPI, it says accessibility within 400 meters, is it a 400 meters because it's a 5-minute walk? And if it's 400 meters, which means a 5-minute walk, who is that actually for? So underneath is just kind of a graph showing what 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and 15 minutes is. So, right, so somebody like an 80-year-old, uh, 10 minutes is 500 meters, and 15 minutes is around 750 meters. However, when you compare that to just an average person, let's say somebody in their 30s, 5 minutes is, or 10 minutes is almost the equivalent to that. So in your KPIs, I know you guys are talking about giving children um, safe drinking water or access to water. You guys have to remember that that child's 15 minutes is totally different than my 15 minutes or somebody riding a bike. And we had a lecture last year by this guy named Jill Penalosa, who he's just pioneering what he called the 880 city, where you're trying to design for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old and see how they interact. And then to the right, we see kind of just which cities are planning for who. So, for example, Paris, a 15-minute city is only walking and cycling. But then if you go to Edinburgh, they're also taking into account wheelchairs and public transportation. And one other thing when it comes to who we're designing for is understanding the differences between inequality, justice, equality, and equity. So just saying like, oh, you can get from point A to point B, therefore you're connected within your network, is sometimes it can be a little biased because everyone here can get there, but maybe the lady in the wheelchair cannot. So just inequality is when some people can use it and some people can't. Then equity is when people are getting the things based on their needs. So down here, she gets a ramp because she needs one. He doesn't get a ramp. He doesn't need one. Everyone's working. However, equality, everyone's getting what the lowest person needs. Everyone's getting the same support regardless. But then the concept of justice in this case is removing the problem in the first place. So here, the curb, she can't use it, he can. What happens if we design a city where she doesn't even have to think that she's missing out on what somebody else has? And that's what justice. So when you're thinking about your KPIs, or specifically when you guys are about to go in the field to map your KPIs and map points, really think about who can actually get there, who cannot, and is when you say yes and no, maybe the scale is a bit more. Maybe it's yes for a man in his 20s, but no for a woman who's 8 years old. So it's a bit more nuanced. And okay, so how do we involve stakeholders, right? So these are the people that we're actually designing for. Um, the IAP2 is most likely what Citylens is gonna use and think about. This framework by the International Association for Public Participation, I really like it. And here, these are two really good sources for you guys to look into. These are probably the only two sources that you guys might even have to use because they're like 80 pages of exactly how you should inform and bring um, stakeholders and the public into your urban planning. And both of these at the very beginning outline this EAP2 um, framework. So everything is kind of based. This is the father of the stakeholder maps. So let's just go through it a little bit. So to inform, right, is just to provide the public and balance and objective information, talk to them. And you're promising that you will keep them informed in the future. Um, and then to consult, right? This is where the public actually can come look at your information and talk about your information, give you advice. This is more like a bottom up approach. You're providing the information, they're talking to you about it. And then in the involve and collaborate, this is when you're starting to think about your projects and you want them to talk and express their concerns or what they want in their projects. And with your collaboration, you include them in like the design process of their city themselves. And finally, to empower someone is by their des- their design that they did and involve and collaborate actually gets implemented. So your promise to them is you will implement what they decide. Um, Going back to just your guys' framework from left to right, I kind of wanted to put this EAP2 in this framework. So you have your group to your benchmarks. This is kind of your information. This is how you're informing yourselves with what to focus on, but this is also how you're informing your stakeholders. That's who you're going to the public with and saying, hey, look, you guys are not performing well in clean sanitation, or you guys are not performing well in deaths by car accidents. And now you go to the public and you consult with them and say, okay, is this the correct benchmark? Are we actually measuring this correctly? Here's the data that we provided. You guys agree with this data? Did we collect it wrong? You talk to them. And then you have your prioritization, which is you can consult, but you can also inform. And I'll talk about that a bit later. And what I mean by that is you can prioritize in a very mathematical way. So that's more like you're informing the public which ones we should prioritize, or you can ask the public and they can kind of prioritize your benchmarks and KPIs themselves. And then once you do that, you get your solutions where you involve and collaborate with your stakeholders to create these solutions. And then finally, your final project is one of their solutions that they have chosen. And then you're just there to make sure that it's implemented. So, one example that I love for when you're consulting benchmarks goes back to because we talked about the 15-minute city. I think this one's amazing. It's called Flower Proximity. Um, so here they went, the IET went to tons of different cities and worked with them, and we're like, okay, here's a radius of 5 minutes, here's a radius of 15, here's a radius of 30 minutes. Where do you guys envision these amenities? So, for example, in Amsterdam, they said a university can be 30 minutes away, but in Ghent, they wanted it a little closer, let's say 20 minutes away. Where here, under entertainment, in Amsterdam, the gym is within the 5 to 15 minutes, but here in Ghent, a gym can be 15 minutes away. So perhaps the people in Amsterdam, right, they care more. Maybe it's a younger crowd, and maybe younger people want to go to the gym. Maybe Ghent is older and people don't necessarily want to go to the gym. So you're kind of tailoring your KPIs for the city. And remember, a KPI is more of a minimum. So a minimum of a park has to be within 400 meters. They're both hitting that minimum. But maybe a minimum for something else could be, um, well, let's take pharmacy, for example. Maybe a pharmacy, the minimum is 15 minutes away, right? But here in Ghent, it's an older population. So a minimum for them is a pharmacy within 5 minutes. And that's what they prefer. And then going back to ranking and prioritization. So here, this was a study in Ottawa, Canada, where they asked rural people living in rural areas how, like, which amenities are more important to them. So if we went to a KPI, for example, all these amenities would be equal, saying, okay, you need them within 500 meters, or you need them within 1500 meters. But now these people were asked, which ones do we care about more? So here in Ottawa, in urban area or suburban areas, they really wanted grocery stores over childcare facilities. Kind of makes sense. Everyone needs to go to the grocery store. Only people with children need to go to childcare facilities. So now, as an urban planner, you say, okay, the KPI says these are all equal, but when we talk to the people, we need to prioritize giving them grocery stores. Um, and here's just another source. This was nice to look at, from the OECD. And here they gave a deliberative democracy database where you could go through, I think, about 1,000 different government kind of calls for deliberation. And example in this one, a citizens jury, um, they were told that they were given 12 environmental issues and they had to discuss and rank them, saying, okay, which one is the most important for human health, ecological health, quality of life, and they had to rank them. So that's a way where you can involve the public in deciding which KPIs are the most important for you. And so the OECD categorized these deliberative processes as citizen assemblies. There's around 50 to 150 people. These are kind of, I'm not going to say invented, like if it's 50 to 150 people, doesn't mean it's a citizen assembly. It's just usually the amount of people that are there. And then citizen juries and panels, 15 to 30, consensus conferences. So that's when experts come, and maybe some people from the public come, but those are usually experts as well. And then they talk about your KPIs. And then deliberative polling is where you randomly choose tons of people from the citizens, usually 100 to 500 people, and you have them answer the question. And then there's online platforms that do the same. You guys might already know this, but I think when it comes to involving stakeholders and people, these are just things I have to mention. Um, so stakeholder mapping, the easiest, right? So maybe in your KPI where it says you need to use X amount of electricity in your house per day, you're not going to go talk to an 8-year-old who doesn't know how much electricity they're using. Their mom is telling them, oh, turn on the light, turn off the light. They don't really know why, right? So that's somebody that has low influence and low interest. They're not really useful in this KPI. But maybe the mother who is paying the bills and understands the amount of electricity, those are somebody with high influence because they can change the way their family is ran, and high influence as well. Um, so once you find those people, then you would go to an empathy map where now you say, okay, this mother, right? What do they see? How do they feel? What do they hear? What do they say and do? And you get their pains and gains. And now you understand a bit more about that person. You can kind of assume, but you could also have the mothers come and tell you what they see, feel, and think. This is what we call like our focus group. Um, so just the process, the framework for finding this focus group is you have your topic, right? Let's say your KPI. You determine the questions you're going to ask your focus group, and you recruit your participants, and then you host your participants that affect the KPI. Once you do that, you would analyze the data. And um, I know Ismail is in this call if he hasn't left. He's right here. So this was our team from Bilbao last year at the Norman Foster Foundation. Um, this is when they went to Bilbao and they got their people that they were planning for, and they had them draw on a map where what they felt was safe, who thought was um, which areas are dangerous, how they feel about going into different places. Are they excluded, or are they included in society? And that's called a design charrette. So that's a method of hosting your focus group. Um, Something that you would, if you guys decide to go with talking to the people, you guys would have to think, okay, how do we host and what is the information we want to get out of them? Can't talk about methods of consulting without just the polls and surveys. You guys know what a poll and survey is. I'm going to leave it here because I'm going to send you this presentation so you guys can use the sources and everything. And then just if you were ever writing a paper, or if you wanted to write down your process, um, terms like consensus decision making. So this is when you're talking to the people and you discuss, you get the proposals, you identify the concerns that people have with your proposals, and then you modify them, and you try to find how many people like those proposals, who doesn't, and you either finalize the decision or you go back and redo the steps. Or if you were ever saying, okay, we did dot voting to decide, that means exactly that, where people are just going up to a board and or selecting, and then it's just majority wins. Ah. All right, moving on to more of a mathematical way to prioritize. This I had fun looking at. This is something you guys might find interesting as well. Um, we could continue this conversation later because I'm pretty interested in it. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but what these are called is like, how do you categorize importance of multi-criteria decision making? So that's saying maybe you guys, no, actually not maybe, you guys definitely have for each subcategory tons of KPIs. But how will you choose which KPIs are the most important in your case? Which ones should you tackle over the other ones? And maybe when you're doing scores to seeing how good of a city is, maybe before looking at how much water pipe you have, maybe the first question should be, do you guys have water in the first place? So that KPI is worth more than another one. So the process I'm going to be, or actually I'll just read. I took this from ChatGPT, the explanation of what multi-criteria decision making is, because it was way clearer than anything else I found. So it's just a method to evaluate, prioritize, or rank multiple alternatives based on often conflicting criteria. It helps in making rational decisions when there's no single best option, but rather a trade-off between different factors. And there's 5 main methods you can go through multi-criteria decision making, called AHP, TOPSIS, Electra, Prometheus, and SAW. And the main one we're going to talk about today is analytical hierarchy process, this one. And it uses pairwise comparison to rank alternatives. I'll explain what pairwise is. Um, and moving forward. All right. So as you can see, we at Citylens, and so does Professor Zawar, we love ladders and connecting circles or squares with lines. We adore it. It's the way we work. So the very first thing is you define your goal, right? So in this case, to the right, choosing a leader. And then you structure your hierarchy. So you start with your goal, then you go to your criteria, and you move on to your alternatives. In this case, the criteria was experience, education, charisma, age, and then they were giving weights. So experience is worth more than age. And maybe in politics that's true. Look at America. Had we have very very old presidents. So age doesn't matter as much, and experience we care more about. Charisma is more important than education. Or you can go for a more um, the more and more criteria and sub criteria you get, the more complicated your network will get. But in this case, they're doing it where everything is even. So your goal is one, your criteria is then half of this goal because there's two. And then your sub criteria, the top number is it's half of the previous one, but it's a quarter of the total. Um, sorry, I started pointing at the screen with my pencil and then realized there's no way you guys would see that. Um, Sub criteria to criteria. Um, then a quarter of the total. And then here, this is an eighth of the total and a quarter of this criteria. So just trying to bring it more into context for you guys. So let's say our question was, what is the best resource practice? And your criteria are your KPIs, um, water availability, number of connections, water consumption per capita, access to safe drinking water, water scarcity index, average supply hours, dietary diversity score, or total water supply. And then you would connect them to, okay, this project has three, this project is connected to four, this project is connected to two. So this project, number two, is probably the best project for um, to move forward with. But this is only true if the connections are all the same weight, if they're all 0.125. But what happens if we wanted to give more importance or less importance to some KPIs? So that's where the pairwise comparison comes in. Um, yeah, I hope you guys are following at this point, but if not, we can talk later. Um, I actually have a quick video to show. This is kind of the best way I can explain pairwise. Simple. All right. We don't really care where it came from. We were not a history class. But now going to just more, right? So here, your pairwise, you know how to get your percentages. That's just shown 60%, 30%, 10%. You can find these numbers either in research papers, but then, okay, that's 0.6, 0.3, 0.1. Now, for our pairwise, we need to make a table, right? So safety to style, safety to comfort. Well, if we look at our numbers, we see that safety here is zero point 0.6, style is zero point 0.3. That means safety is twice as much as style. So people care about safety has twice the importance as style does. And that's basically what this um, graph is showing, that when you go to style and safety, safety is twice as important as style is. Um, so I just took 3 and 3. So right, water availability, they cancel out because they're the same. Access to drinking water, right? So when they're in the diagonal, it's always one. They always you can't compare yourself to yourself, so you get one. But then they're the reciprocal. So water availability, according to access to safe drinking water, is zero point 0.5. But then when you Flip it, access to safe drinking water to water availability is 2. So they're always paired up like this, zero point 0.5 to 3.3. Um, and for these, to find these ratios, you guys can either do workshops where you talk to people and say, hey, what do you guys think is more important? And you take polls, kind of like the video did, where people were asked which one's more important, um, this or this. And because 8 out of 20 people chose the Van Gogh picture, therefore it's 40%. So you guys can either come up with these numbers yourselves, or research papers might suggest these numbers. Um, and once you get the numbers, to continue with the process, you do a test to test if your numbers are accurate or if they're false. I've linked the 2 things I just showed down here, so you guys can, if you're interested in this method, you guys can watch the videos and read more about it. I did the math on a piece of paper, and it was so ugly that I didn't want to show you. So I used my trusty friend to explain the process way better than my scrap piece of paper could. Um, but basically, here's the the chart that I just showed you guys above, and you add the columns together, right? So down here, you add the columns, you get your sum, and because the columns and the rows are the same variables, same KPIs, you have to, whatever you do to the columns, you're doing to the rows. So here you take your numbers, divide it. I'm going to let you guys look at this by yourselves more. I'm not really going to explain the whole thing, but then eventually you just get your weights, right? So this is weighting the importance. So it says water availability is true weight is 28.8%, access to safe drinking water is 26, water scarcity is 44.9%. Um, and once you have these numbers, this is your test to see if your variables, if it's true, yes or no. So they're basically finding what they call lambda. And once you find lambda, you find the max, lambda max. This is the maximum strength or multiplication one can have compared to the other one, according to our list. You run compute consistency, and you compute a consistency ratio. And these ratios, Ri, right? This variable gives you Ci. This Ri variable is just a set number. So because our matrix is a matrix of 3, there's 3 KPIs on both sides. You divide it by 0.58, 0.58, and you get your result of 0.0318. To double check, if your value is over zero point 0.1, that means this is totally wrong. Like this, it means that you're you're overweighing. Maybe water scarcity is not 3 times more important than water availability. It's saying that it doesn't really make sense. Maybe some are under evaluated and some are over evaluated, which is good because I invented these, right? Don't use these. These are just an explanation. Um, and here was another idea, right? So this is kind of where it goes back to Mikhail's presentation, where he was saying, okay, if you um, if you walk, for example, you're not using as much pollution compared to if you're flying a plane. So now you go to your public transportation, walking, pedestrian, these are your alternatives, kind of your KPIs, and you take criteria to evaluate your KPIs, your clean air, your economy, your jobs, maybe your noise reduction, um, social isolation, affordability. And these values will affect your your KPIs differently, and that might give you, you might say, okay, when it comes to reducing air pollution, like walking is the best. So we should have walking ranked higher than public transportation. Um, I hope I'm making sense. Um, Going into TOPSIS, I'm not going to explain this. The first three steps are quite similar, but theoretically, the way it works is you have your best possible solution and you have your worst possible solution, and you kind of you rank your alternatives. So to remind you, these are the alternatives, right? You put your alternatives here. You have your best possible case. So let's say the best possible case is you are emitting zero emissions, and then you score all your alternatives here, and you do the math to see which alternative is the closest to the ideal situation. And in this case, we'll say walking, because walking means you don't emit any CO2. So walking is your best solution. And then that score for this positive distance is the distance you're doing the math for. I'm going to skip this. And you can always run cost benefit analyses. If you guys know what that is, that's just to, you identify the costs of everything, um, and then monetize like the value of time and everything else, and you kind of just say, okay, this is the most important or the most expensive, least expensive for the benefits that we get, and you can rank it on that as well. Municipalities do this a lot of the time because they want cheap, fast, and effective. Like that's your goal. It's hard to find those solutions, but you can rank them like that as well. Um, so just to conclude my presentation, um, kind of the where Citylens, I think we need to dive more in, as well as if you guys are interested in this topic to dive in it as well. But you get your benchmarks. Um, you will design your stakeholder method. You will update your benchmarks according to these stakeholders. You will find the criteria to measure your benchmarks. So is that CO2 safety, and then you will prioritize your criteria and your benchmarks to see what you find is more important. And how will this help you? This will help um, when you guys go to the field to actually collect your data. You will see what KPI should be collected. Where should your effort go? Should you collect more of one KPI versus the other one because that affects more people? Or it also will tell you what projects to focus on compared to maybe benchmark 6 is not as important as benchmark 2. So you're going to, when you actually decide to do your project, you're going to focus on the second benchmark. And yeah, thank you. I hope this was interest. It gave you a new idea of how to move forward. And yeah, interested to hear your comments and things like that as well. Thank you.